Now, what was the Southern white man to do upon noticing that a key portion of the workforce, Negroes, were leaving the South by the droves? Was he supposed to just sit back and act like nothing was happening? Or was he expected to do any and everything in his power to stop them from going? This is what we're going to cover today. And so the setting is just about 1916, when Negroes were leaving the South and headed north. The reasons for this migration varied from low wages to unacceptable treatment by the whites. These are the reasons why they took off. So we'll continue our studies from the 1920 book titled Negro Migration During the War by Emmett J. Scott. Excellence. The departure of the first Negroes usually elicited no concern from the authorities. It was assumed that their actions were merely expressions of the Negroes' love for travel, and that they would soon return. When, however, they did not return and hosts of others followed, the white South became deeply concerned and endeavored to check the movement. The whites saw Negroes leaving in the beginning, and they didn't think anything of it. But once they began running the numbers and realized that out of an inventory of 10,000 Negroes, they only had 5,000 or 6,000, then they knew that this was much more than a sightseeing vacation for Negroes. So at this point, they thought to slow the movement. Throughout the Exodus, drastic legislation and force were employed. In Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Georgia, laws were passed in an effort to suppress the activities of labor agents. Those were the recruiters from the North who were paid to recruit workers, and both blacks and whites did this type of work. So since the Southern labor force was being drained rapidly, and labor agents were partly responsible for this, these Southern states passed laws targeting labor agent activities. Licenses were made prohibitively high. Labor agents were arrested and heavily fined. In some cases, their coming was penalized to prohibit their operations entirely, and they frequently suffered physical injury. In Florida, labor recruiting early assumed a serious aspect. Precaution was, therefore, taken to impede the progress of the work of labor agents among Negroes, at first by moral suasion and then by actual force. The cities and towns of this state enacted measures requiring a very high license of labor agents, imposing in case of failure to comply with these regulations, a penalty of imprisonment. So pay the heavy fee or go to prison. Florida wasn't playing any games when it came to this. For example, in Tampa, when these operations were brought to the attention of the authorities, Joe Robinson, a Negro officer, was detailed to investigate the matter. He discovered that one Joyce and another Negro named Alex Reeves were implicated in the movement. Uh-oh! These men were charged with having collected $7 from each of several hundred Negroes who wanted to go to Pennsylvania. A meeting among the Negroes of Tampa was then held to secure pledges of assistance for the Negro officer, then making an effort to prevent the exodus. So other Negroes in the community banded together to assist this officer in his efforts. Now, why would they want to stop Negroes from going north? He's about to explain. Being under the impression that the ignorant members of their race were being imposed upon by agents from without, many of these leading Negroes pledged themselves to assist in the suppression of it. They believed the labor agents were exploiting ignorant blacks by making exaggerated promises about jobs, wages, and housing. So in their mind, they believed they were protecting the community by suppressing the movement, because most people do what they believe is right in the sight of the Lord. In Jacksonville, where the labor agents flourished, the city council passed an ordinance requiring that migration agents should pay $1,000 license to recruit labor sent out of the state, under penalty of $600 fine and 60 days in jail. Several police detectives were assigned the task of arresting those who were said to be spreading false reports among Negroes there to the effect that special trains were ready on various specified dates to take them to points in the North. At Thomasville, a white man and a Negro were arrested, charged with the usual crime of being labor agents, verifying that it was both blacks and whites doing this. Much excitement followed. Fearing serious results, the colored ministers of this city endeavored to stop the exodus. A committee of their most prominent citizens met with the mayor and discussed the matter freely. They arranged for a large mass meeting of white and colored citizens who undertook to cooperate in bringing the exodus to an end. The white citizens of Waycross experienced the same trouble with labor agents, but had much difficulty in finding out exactly who they were and how they contrived to make such inroads on the population. The labor agents were too smooth and incognito with their recruiting. The whites saw all the blacks suddenly leaving and probably thought that Jesus had returned to rapture Negroes and left them behind. They couldn't figure out where Negroes were going and who was convincing them to leave. It was a great mystery to them. The situation became more critical in Savannah, one of the largest assembling points for migrants in the South. When the loss of labor became so serious and ordinary efforts to check it failed, more drastic measures were resorted to. Time to step it up. Here we go. On the 13th of August, for example, when there spread through the city the rumor that 2 special trains would leave for the North, there followed great commotion among the Negroes, who, already much disturbed by the agitation for and against the movement, were easily induced to start for the North, when, at about 5 o'clock that morning, 2,000 Negroes assembled at the station for this purpose. The county police, augmented by a detachment of city officers, appeared at the station and attempted to clear the tracks. This was wild. They sent police to the train station to physically stop Negroes from leaving. This is what it had to come down to, huh? But the crowd being so large, the officers finally found their task impossible, for as they would clear one section of the tracks, the crowd would surge to another. The crowd was extremely orderly and good-natured, and the 2 arrests that were made were for minor offenses. They weren't trying to be belligerent. They just wanted to get on the train and leave, that's all. Let the people leave. As these trains failed to move according to orders, over 300 of this group paid their own fares and proceeded to the North. Alabama was equally alive to the need to suppress the migration propaganda among Negroes. To this end, the Montgomery City Commission on September 19, 1916, passed an ordinance to the effect that any person who would entice, persuade, or influence any laborer or other person to leave the city of Montgomery for the purpose of being employed at any other place as a laborer must on conviction be fined not less than $1 nor more than $100, or may be sentenced to hard labor for the city, for not more than 6 months, one or both in the discretion of the court. Similar to Florida. If you were caught trying to entice workers to go north for work, then you were either fined or sent to jail with the possibility of doing slave labor. The other ordinance provided that any person, firm, or corporation who published, printed or wrote or delivered or distributed or posted or caused to be published, printed or written or delivered or distributed or posted any advertisement, letter, newspaper, pamphlet, handbill, or other writing for the purpose of enticing, persuading, or influencing any laborer or other person to leave the city of Montgomery for the purpose of being employed at any other place as a laborer must on conviction be fined not less than $100, or may be sentenced to hard labor for the city for not more than 6 months, one or both in the discretion of the court. Labor agents and other leaders, both white and black, were arrested throughout the state in accordance with the usual custom of preferring technical charges. The treatment of the movement in Mississippi was no exception to the rule. At Jackson, the pass riders, as they were called, were so molested by the police that they were finally driven from the town. A pass rider was typically a black person whose train fare was paid for by a northern company, or who was given a free railroad pass. The police harassed them because they knew what was happening. Negroes were leaving, and they were directed to stop them. In the same town, the citizens were reported to have forced the railroads to discontinue the use of passes on the threat of damaging their interest and influencing decisions in court cases. Negroes were secretly enticed away, however, after they had been dispersed from the railway stations and imprisoned when in the act of boarding the trains. The police interfered at one time with Negroes leaving, especially when it was suspected that they were leaving on passes. To circumvent this, Negroes would go 2 or 3 stations below Jackson where there were no policemen and board the trains. A smooth and simple solution to the problem, right? It was the unanimous opinion of whites and blacks who observed the almost frantic efforts to leave the town, that any attempt to hinder by intimidation or by making it difficult to leave simply served to make them more determined to leave. You know how when someone tries to keep something from you and it makes you more curious? That's what's happening here. The attempts to make them stay made them more determined to find out what they were being kept away from. It probably made them think that if they're trying to stop us so badly, then maybe the North is really a better place. And now I need to see it even more for myself. After having enforced these drastic measures without securing satisfactory results, and having seen that any attempt to hold the Negroes by force resulted apparently in an increased determination to leave, there was resort to the policy of frightening the Negroes away from the North by circulating rumors as to the misfortunes to be experienced there. Now it's time to try another tactic. Negroes were then warned against the rigors of the northern winter and the death rate from pneumonia and tuberculosis. Social workers in the North reported frequent cases of men with simple colds who actually believed that they had developed consumption. Speakers who wished to discourage the exodus reported exact figures on the death rate of the migrants in the North that were astounding. As, for example, it was said by one Reverend Mr. Parks that there were 2,000 of them sick in Philadelphia. Making up figures to frighten Negroes was wild. The editor of a leading white paper in Jackson, Mississippi, made the remark that he feared that the result of the first winter's experience in the North would prove serious to the South, insofar as it would remove the bugbear of the northern climate. The returned migrants were encouraged to speak in disparagement of the North and to give wide publicity to their utterances, emphasizing incidents of suffering reported through the press. These are the same games people play today in media. Get a person up there to tell an emotionally appealing story to get people to buy into that reality. These are old school psychological games. But was it enough to stop the Negro? When such efforts as these failed, however, the disconcerted planters and businessmen of the South resorted to another plan. Heck no, it wasn't enough. The fever was way too strong for a few people to come back and tell their sob stories. And plus, there were way more other successful stories circulating within the black community. So the business people had to come harder than this if they wanted to stop the exodus. Reconciliation and persuasion were tried. Sweet-talking the Negro is what they tried next. Meetings were held and speakers were secured and advised what to say. In cities and communities where contact on this plane had been infrequent, it was a bit difficult to approach the subject. The press of Georgia gave much space to the discussion of the movement and what ought to be done to stop it. The consensus of opinion of the white papers in the state was that the Negro had not been fairly treated, and that better treatment would be one of the most effective means of checking the migration. This was part of the sweet talking. They already tried to intimidate Negroes, but that didn't work. So at this point, the game plan was to turn Negroes into buttermilk biscuits by treating them better so they could stay. And it's amazing how this was the most obvious solution, but it was the last option they resorted to, right? It was wild back then in the South, I'm telling you. Mob violence, it was pointed out, was one of the chief causes of the exodus. Who would have thought? The Tifton, Georgia Gazette, commenting on the causes, said,
"They have allowed Negroes to be lynched, 5 at a time, on nothing stronger than suspicion. They have allowed whole sections to be depopulated of them. They have allowed them to be white-capped and to be whipped, and their homes burned, with only the weakest and most spasmodic efforts to apprehend or punish those guilty, when any efforts were made at all. Loss of much of the state's best labor is one of the prices Georgia is paying for unchecked mob activity against Negroes, often charged only with ordinary crimes." Current dispatches from Albany, Georgia, in the center of the section apparently most affected, and where efforts are being made to stop the exodus by spreading correct information among the Negroes, say that the heaviest migration of Negroes has been from those counties in which there have been the worst outbreaks against Negroes. It is developed by investigation that where there have been lynchings, the Negroes have been most eager to believe what the emigration agents have told them of plots for the removal or extermination of the race.
If they wanted to get Negroes moving quickly, then tell them about a plan to relocate or exterminate them. Tell them that they plan to relocate them to Africa or Cuba. Then a labor agent could have 1,000 Negroes ready to go north the same night. And after a lynching had just occurred within the area and the emotions were running high, convince them that they plan to send all the Negroes to the afterlife. These were some of the tactics that the labor agents used. At Thomasville, Georgia, a mass meeting of colored citizens of the town with many from the country was held at the courthouse, and addresses were made by several prominent white men, as well as by several colored, with a view to taking some steps in regard to the exodus of Negroes from this section to the north and west. The whole sentiment of the meeting was very amicable, the Negroes applauding enthusiastically the speeches of the white men and the advice given by them. Resolutions were drawn up by a committee expressing the desire that the people of the two races continue to live together as they have done in the past, and that steps be taken to adjust any difference between them. After a conference of 3 days at Waycross, Georgia, the Negroes came to a decision as to the best manner in which to present their cause to the white people, with a view to securing their cooperation towards the improvement of conditions in the South to make that section more habitable.
There are 4 things of which our people complain, and this conference urges our white friends to secure for us these things with all possible speed. First, more protection at the hands of the law. We ask that the law of the state, made and enforced by white men, should be made to apply with exact justice to both races.
Whew. This was an extremely difficult thing to request from Southern whites at this time. Justice for all people? This was one of the most troubling concepts of the mind for them. For them, this was on par with trying to comprehend Einstein's theory of relativity. It was that hard for them to truly comprehend equitable justice under the law for all people.
We have no sympathy for criminals, but we ask that the innocent shall be protected to the fullest extent of the law. Second, that more liberal provisions be made for the education of our people.
Both very reasonable requests coming from the citizens of the nation, don't you think? They commended Governor Dorsey for his courageous recommendation in his inaugural address that an agricultural school should be established for Negroes in some center in southern Georgia, and asked their friends everywhere to urge the members of the legislature from the various counties to put Governor Dorsey's noble sentiments into law. These memorialists felt, too, that as far as possible, wages should be in keeping with the cost of living, and that the white people generally should take an interest in the general welfare of the Negroes. Tuskegee Institute was also quick to offer a remedy for the migration. Now we have Mr. Booker T. Washington's institute getting involved. Now, unfortunately, he had died in 1915, just before the migration really took off. It had already started in 1910, but it didn't really take off until after he died. So he didn't really get to see how wild it got. But his institute still spoke on it. In the latter part of September 1916, the institution made a strong effort to persuade the Negro farmers to remain on the land instead of going to the cities. The same thing that Mr. Washington had preached before. He claimed that Negroes should stay in the country where they prosper and not go into the cities where they tend to not do so well. Conferences were held with the bankers of Tuskegee and with many planters of Macon County, and a method of dealing with the situation was worked out. This method embraced a number of helpful suggestions as to how to solve their many perplexing problems. At the 26th Annual Negro Conference at Tuskegee Institute, the institution took that occasion to send through certain declarations a message to the Negroes of the South. These declarations recited the distress and suffering impelling the Negroes to migrate, expressing the appreciation of the necessity to do something to better their condition by embracing the new opportunities offered them in the North. On the other hand, this institution felt that there were many permanent opportunities for the masses of the colored people in the South, which is now entering upon a great era of development. Among these are the millions of acres of land yet to be cultivated, cities to be built, railroads to be extended, and mines to be worked. All of these permanent opportunities, meaning opportunities that were not highly rewarding in the short term, but potentially extremely rewarding in the long. Building a city is not a small task. It's extremely difficult. It requires a lot of components, and it takes many decades to build it. And typically the people who lay the foundation don't live to see it thrive. So this certainly requires long-term thinking and dedication. This is what Mr. Washington was proposing. These memorialists considered it of still greater importance to the Negro that in the South they have acquired land, buildings, etc., valued at about $500 million. The institution didn't think blacks should have jumped up and just left all of that behind. The Negroes were therefore urged to stay on the soil which they owned, which a lot did. But the ones that left had to do so because they needed to fulfill their role on the cosmic stage. There was a clear path to leave, which eventually put in motion a lot of things that came afterwards. So it was all for a larger objective. Addressing a word to the white people of the South, the conference said that the disposition of so many of the blacks to leave is not because they do not love the Southland, but because they believe that in the North they will not only have more opportunity to get more money, but that they will get better treatment, better protection under the law, and better school facilities for their children. That was the path they saw wide open for them. Now, whether it played out like they thought it would, that's a different story. But this was a wide open path that they saw. The conference urged, therefore, that the Southern white people avail themselves of their greatest opportunity to cooperate with the blacks in the various communities and have a thorough understanding as to working for the common welfare of all. The delegates believed that the time had come for the best element of the whites and blacks to unite to protect the interests of both races, to the end that more effective work may be done in the upbuilding of a greater South. In the same way, the people of Mississippi soon discovered that any attempt forcibly to hold Negroes resulted apparently in an increased determination to leave. Nor was it sufficient to warn the Negroes against the rigors of the northern winter and the death rate from pneumonia and tuberculosis. In Greenwood, Mississippi, the difficulty was circumvented by using the Red Cross and the food conservation meetings as a forum for the discussion of the movement. This was the first time that the Negroes and whites of Greenwood had met to discuss matters of mutual welfare. Bishop W.P. Thurkield of New Orleans addressed a body of Negroes and whites on the movement. He suggested that whites get representative colored persons together and find the cause. He also suggested a remedy through better treatment, more wages, and more cooperation between the races. Negro ministers stated that they were offered sums of money by bankers, planters, and merchants to speak in discouragement of the movement. Some spoke, and others, by far the greater number, seemed to have remained neutral. They couldn't buy them out. And remember, the ministers were stuck in an uncomfortable position. If they spoke against the migration, it might appear to the congregation that they were trying to hold them back. But if they spoke for the migration, then it would appear that they were going against the interest of the southern states. So it was best for them to remain neutral, which apparently most of them did. It was found necessary to increase wages from 10 to 25%, and in some cases as much as 100% to hold labor. Come on. The reasons for migration given by Negroes were sought. In almost all cases, the chief complaint was about treatment. A subcommittee of 17 men was appointed to look into the labor situation. There were 12 white men and 5 Negroes. The subcommittee met and reported to the body that the present labor shortage was due to the migration, and that the migration was due to a feeling of insecurity before the law, the unrestrained action of mobs, unfair methods of yearly settlement on farms, and inadequate school facilities. As a result of the report, it was agreed to make an appropriation of $25,000 towards an agricultural high school, as a step towards showing an interest in the Negroes of Bolivar County, and thus give them reasons for remaining. Now look at that. Finally getting some funds towards some education. It took Negroes nearly emptying the whole state to get whites to provide some funds. This stuff is wild. But often this is what people have to do. Sometimes you have to be willing to leave a situation entirely to get what you feel rightfully belongs to you. And that's what we see here. A campaign was started to make unpopular the practice among farmers of robbing Negroes of the returns from their labor, and a general effort was made by a few of the leading men behind the movement to create a better feeling between the races. Wide publicity was given to the experiment in plantation government, and the policy was accepted by a number of planters as opportunistic action. Thus, one Mr. Abbott of Natchez, Mississippi, told the planters of his section that good treatment, adequate and sympathetic oversight are the important factors in any effort to hold labor. He made a trip to his farm every week, endeavoring to educate his tenants in modes of right living. Every man on his place had a bank account and was apparently satisfied. You see how the mood and atmosphere was changing now that Negroes were taken off? This example was presented with the statement that where these methods had been used, few had left. One planter purchased 28 Ford automobiles to sell on easy terms to his tenants, with the hope of contenting them. The newspapers published numerous letters from Southern Negro leaders urging Negroes to consider well their step, asserting that the South is the best place for them and that the Southern white man knows them and will in consequence be more lenient with their shortcomings. The papers further urged an increase in wages and better treatment. Wherever possible, there were published articles which pointed to the material prosperity of Negroes in the South. For example, a writer of Greenville said of Negroes' loyalty in 1917,
"The prosperity as well as the patriotism of the Negro farmer has been shown in the purchase of Liberty bonds in the Delta. Many colored farm laborers subscribed for bonds. Every family on the place of planter C.D. Walcott near Hollandale took a bond, while one Negro, Bully Cox, a renter, bought bonds to the amount of $1,000 and gave his check for the total amount out of the savings of this year from his crop and still has cotton to sell. There are Negro families on Delta plantations making more money this year than the salary of the governor of the state."
Anything to get Negroes to stay. If they had to publish stories on their success, then that's what they had to do. But anything to get Negroes to stay. A Jackson, Mississippi, daily paper that had been running a column of humorous incidents about Negroes taken from the daily court sessions, which was very distasteful to the colored people of the city, discontinued it. You see that? Such methods as these have been the only ones to prove effective in bringing about an appreciable stem in the tide. With the advent of the United States government constructing cantonments and establishing manufacturing plants in the South, the millions thus diverted to that section have caused such an increase in wages that the movement has been decidedly checked. So they succeeded, according to Emmett J. Scott, in checking the migration, at least to a degree and for a short while. But what we can see right here is the effort they put into stopping Negroes from leaving. And it was nothing short of an all-out game plan. They tried intimidation tactics, and when that didn't work, they eventually had to acquiesce to some of the, at least to some degree, to the demands of Negroes, which had allowed them to have much more success. But all in all, Negroes still left to the north, and they went off to start their new journey. So next we'll see how blacks generally adjusted in their new environment in the northern cities, right? So definitely stay tuned for that. But right now, I want to thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.